Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome back to our morning briefing series. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Kaiser Forum here at DGAP. Today, we are looking at Venezuela, US foreign policy, and international order in the wake of Nicolàs Maduro's capture and extraction last weekend. International reactions have been mixed. Many Western leaders said they would shed no tears for the end of the Maduro regime, while also expressing various levels of concern and criticism about the US move and about its consequences for a rules-based international order. There are differing views on the extent to which the US will now be involved in Venezuela's political future, and so Venezuela is heading into political uncertainty as interim President Delcy Rodriguez is swaying between cooperating with the US on the one hand and continuing the Maduro government on the other. However, President Donald Trump and his administration have left little doubt about their motivations: heavy crude oil, hemispheric influence, and a sheer display of power. Trump has gone on to stress the strategic importance of other territories for the US, including Greenland. Stephen Miller, his deputy chief of staff, has asserted that Greenland rightfully belonged to the United States. And so it seems that in 2026, we wake up in a new world of power politics and American interventionism. A world that Europeans still struggle with. High Representative Kaja Kallas and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz in particular have been criticized for their lukewarm reactions and their reluctance to criticize the US, and for a lack of Europe's efforts at becoming more independent. Now, how did this crisis of international rules come about? What's to be expected for the future of Venezuela and the other countries that the Trump administration has mentioned? And what can we in Europe do to defend the international order that our own freedom and welfare rely on in the face of a transatlantic ally that many say cannot be relied on anymore? To discuss these and other questions, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. First up will be Professor Susanne Gratius, who's Professor of International Relations at Autonomous University of Madrid and also an Associate Senior Researcher at the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, CIDOB. Previously, she was inter alia an Associate Professor for International Relations at Complutense University of Madrid, and also a researcher in former days at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP, and the Institute for Latin American Studies that's now at GIGA in Hamburg. So in a way, welcome back to Germany, Professor Gratius. Next will be Professor Helmut Aust, who's Professor of Public and International Law at Freie Universität Berlin, and also an Associate Fellow in the Center for Security and Defense here at DGAP. He has held various visiting positions at the Lauterbach Center for International Law at Cambridge, the Institute for International Law and the Humanities, University of Melbourne, the Institut des Études Internationales at Paris, and most recently also in the US at Georgia State University College of Law. Helmut Aust has commented recently in the media about the reactions, the German reactions, Chancellor Merz's reactions, as a little bit unfortunate. So I'll be interested to hear about his legal assessment in a second. Last but not least, Dr. Patrick Keller is head of the Center for Security and Defense here at DGAP. Before joining us last year, he worked at BDLI, which is the German Aerospace Industry Association, and before that, he was with the Federal Ministry of Defense. He also served as vice president of the Federal Academy for Security Policy, known as BAX in this country, and earlier in his career also worked with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Welcome back to the morning briefing, Patrick. Now, before we begin, just a quick reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We will kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks each, and then open up for questions and answers after about 30 minutes. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand, and then when invited to speak, briefly introduce yourself and keep it relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to all my colleagues supporting this morning briefing series in the comms and events teams and elsewhere in the Research Institute. Thanks a lot. So without much further ado, let's begin by looking at Venezuela, the lead up to the US intervention, the current situation, and perhaps a few words also about the future, what awaits Venezuela in this moment. Let me hand things over to you, Susanne Gratius.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm radicated in Madrid, so I'm not in Venezuela. So it's difficult to see how the future of Venezuela or the current situation is. I'm in contact with many people, and for the moment, it looks like continuity. And at the end, it was not like the justification for the military attacks were not drugs, but the oil sector. I think we all can confirm that. And for the moment, Delcy Rodriguez was the former vice president of Maduro, so she represents more the civilian phase of the regime, together with his brother Jorge Rodriguez, who is in charge of the parliament. And then we have the other two. It's like four key people in Venezuela. Then we have the military, the representation of the armed forces by Defense Minister Padrino Lopez. He's in charge for many years, decades, no? of the defense ministry. And then we have Diosdado Cabello, who was said to be the real face or the real chief of the drugs cartel, Los Soles. So I think drugs is not really the key issue or the security threat mentioned by Trump and Marco Rubio. So now we have like a three steps plan introduced yesterday by Marco Rubio, which will foresee stabilization. At the first stage, we don't know how much or how many months this will last. Then we have the recovery, which means mainly the foreign investors investing in the Venezuelan oil sector. The first one is that the U.S. takes control over the oil sector. And the third step will be like a minor issue, the transition. So we don't know when we can expect that to happen. It reminds me a little bit of what happened in Cuba under the Bush administration, the Cuba transition coordinator and the blueprint for a democratic transition in Cuba. The difference is that we now have a real military attack, a military intervention, and the president is in the United States and will be judged there in the United States. What will the future of Venezuela bring? For the moment, everybody expected the opposition to take power, but this has not happened. So I don't see that this in a foreseeable future will happen, because the strategic interest of the United States is oil, not for their own purposes, but to take out Russia, mainly Russia, not so much China, and China out of the country. So this is a new version of the Monroe Doctrine. It has been said many times, and we have this kind of re-establishment of the Roosevelt Doctrine, which has been also mentioned by Trump in his national security strategy. So what can we expect? Who will be next? Which country will be next?
That is indeed one of the questions that we want to come to. Before I hand over to Helmut Aust, let me ask a brief follow-up question, Susanne Gratius, if I may. Because some people have asked why Maria Machado does not play a role now, who has dedicated her Peace Nobel Prize to President Trump, but who President Trump said was not very tough, was not, that it would be too tough for her to be the leader of Venezuela now. So can you say a little bit about her and maybe also about Edmundo González in the immediate political future of Venezuela?
Yeah, if we go back to the times of Juan Guaido, who's now living in exile, as all the opposition forces now, the great opposition figures in Venezuela, she has also left the country. And the problem in 2019, when Juan Guaido tried to be the legitimate president of Venezuela, is that the world recognized him, or 60 or more than 60 countries, but he has had no power concerning the armed forces, which are really ruling Venezuela, or now maybe the US, but the US together with the armed forces. This might also be the problem for Delcy Rodriguez, because she controls the oil sector, and many other things, but she is not in control over the armed forces. So this may be the reason that Trump discarded Maria Corina Machado, Edmundo González Urrutia to rule the country. And he said, we will run the country. So this is a direct imperialist intervention in the country, an attack against national sovereignty. And I think Maria Corina Machado, she won the Nobel Prize and not Donald Trump. So maybe there's a kind of personal thing between these two. I don't know. But she backed the military attacks, which was a little bit surprising for me. I think it was not maybe necessary to do that. But then for her, that didn't play out for the moment.
Thanks so much. Let's move over to a legal assessment and the implications for international law and order. Helmut Aust, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much for the kind invitation and introduction. I was told that we have 5 minutes each, so I will try to be brief. I would like to make 3 points in my brief intervention. First, very briefly, setting out why indeed the US intervention on the 3rd of January is illegal under international law, and why we also have continuing breaches of international law. Second, whether this is anything new, so what sets this intervention apart from other breaches of international law in the past. And third, why it is important that European states react appropriately to this situation. Now, the first point. I would say that contrary to what the Federal Chancellor Merz first said on the weekend, the legal situation is not complex. There are many situations in international relations where the legal assessment can be complex, but this is not one. The political context may be complex, the legal assessment is not. And I will be very brief in this regard, as I would say it's quite obvious that we have a blatant case of illegality here. And also, as yesterday, the spokesperson for the federal government, Stefan Cornelius, has also somewhat nuanced the position of the German government. We have a clear-cut violation of the prohibition of the threat and use of force under Article 2.4 of the Charter, and there is clearly no legal basis for a justification of this use of force in sight. We have obviously no authorization by the Security Council, and it is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to make a case that self-defense is relevant here. All this talk about narco-terrorism is not related to anything that international lawyers would typically consider to give rise to an armed attack, which can trigger the right of self-defense. Just 2 other brief points on the doctrinal black letter law, so to speak. The questionable legitimacy of Maduro as president, however one views that, cannot be a pretext to violate Article 2.4. So regardless of whether he was lawfully and legitimately president of Venezuela, this does not give rise to a right of the United States to use force. And secondly, I would say it's also important to note that we have an ongoing violation of Article 2.4 of the Charter, which does not just prohibit the use of force, but also the threat of force. And the way in which at this press conference on the weekend, it was made clear that there would be very clear demands on the interim leadership, and that second wave could be coming any time. This is a textbook example of a prohibited threat to use force as well. Second major point, is this anything new? Do we need to worry? Why is this so? We have seen many violations of international law in the past, also by the United States. And indeed, one could say here, is this not just a repetition of what we have seen in Panama, for instance, in 1989, 1990, when General Noriega was flown out of the country? And is this not just something that we are just accustomed to? I would say there is a fundamental difference here in the situation we see today, and this is mostly due to the way the current US administration is justifying or not justifying its conduct. how it is no longer framing its position in accepted categories of international law. It is speaking with outright disdain for international law. It openly admits that it is interested in the oil reserves, so there is not even a pretense to act according to the established categories of international law, and especially this form of personal threat making that accompanies that really creates the impression that this is politics in what could only be called some kind of mafia style. That's a characterization that also Jan Werner Müller used yesterday in a piece for The Guardian. Third point, what can countries like Germany and other EU member states do now? What have they done, and does this suffice? As mentioned, I found the initial statement of the German government to be somewhat lacking. It's good to see that this position has been somewhat nuanced yesterday, and I also completely understand the difficult political situation in which the statement has been made. And indeed, we have many voices now in the media, experts who say that we simply cannot afford to insist on international law in the face of the Russian threat for Ukraine and also by extension to Europe and our own weakness. I wonder, however, whether this is not missing the point. We have seen in the Security Council that states like Mexico, for instance, very bravely stood up and clearly identified the US violation of international law. And arguably, Mexico is in a position which is much more exposed to direct US power politics than European states. So I would say it's not a question whether Germany and other European states can still afford to insist on international law. I would put it the other way around. We cannot afford not to rely on international law. And this becomes very clear if we look at the situation with respect to Greenland. We had a joint statement by the German government and 6 other heads of states and governments in which also the unwavering defense of universal principles of territorial integrity was emphasized, and arguably the statement would be much stronger and would also find more support internationally if European states would also be willing to speak out clearly in the face of international law violations in situations like Venezuela. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Helmut. Aust. This is a very good segue into Patrick Keller's statements, because now we move slowly towards the European and German reactions. What can we do? Is this a precedent for future interventions? What does it mean for the international security order more broadly? And Patrick Keller will not only share his remarks, but he has already published a piece together with our director, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, which is on our website. The events team will be happy to share the link in the chat. It's in German and English versions. But Patrick, over to you for your remarks.
Thank you very much, Jan, for the introduction and for sharing this article that I wrote with Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff. Thank you all for being here this morning. It's a pleasure to join such a distinguished panel. I will try and follow Helmut Aust's example and provide 3 points on international security implications of what happened last weekend in Venezuela. The first point is, as has been said here, there is a long tradition of the United States intervening in their own backyard, as they see it. Think of Ronald Reagan in Grenada, Bush Sr. in Nicaragua, Bill Clinton in Haiti. But still, what happened here now is of a different quality. And the main difference in my mind is that Trump and his administration are blatantly assuming the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary, as has been mentioned by Professor Gratius. The Roosevelt Corollary basically says, in addition to the Monroe Doctrine, which said that European imperial powers need to leave the Americas, that the Western Hemisphere was the sole area of influence of the United States. The Roosevelt Corollary of Theodore Roosevelt said, well, there's also the right of the United States to intervene militarily at leisure to establish order in that hemisphere. This is what Trump and his people are referring to. They are thinking in spheres of influence and in great power logic, not in the logic of international law. What they say is might makes right. In that, I think it's important to note, is a clear contrast to recent previous American policy. Think of John Kerry, the Secretary of State of the Obama administration, who said the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. I think it's another incident of the Trump administration emphasizing its opposition and contrast to the Obama administration. I think this is underappreciated still in what regard the Trump administration is trying to do something opposite and different from this particular predecessor. So they are thinking in great power logic, and they are thinking in spheres of influence. And also important to note, it is not an accident. By the standards of the Trump policy and the Trump administration, it is a very coherent move. Think of the national security strategy that the US published late last year, where the Western Hemisphere was put as the #1 priority of American foreign policy. Some people were surprised by that, but here you see the follow-up. So there is a surprising coherence by Trump standards. It is almost logical what happened now in Venezuela. And I think it does not bode well for future security situations in the Americas. Second point. Trump is known to be a boastful, intimidating speaker. Sometimes he reminds me of an American wrestler giving a promo, an interview statement, where the effect is more important than truth or reality. And he can change attitudes according to the storyline and the character. So it can be contradictory at times. You can find quotes of Trump's that contradict each other all the time on all matters, really. But that doesn't mean that he's not serious. He's like a wrestler giving a promo. He's always true to character and that moment and storyline. Think back to Peter Thiel during the first Trump administration, advising the Europeans to take Trump's rhetoric not literally, but seriously. I think what we can say now with what happened in Venezuela is that Trump, more often than not, is willing to follow up on his rhetoric. We need to start to take him not just seriously, but also literally. We need to prepare that he might follow up on what he's saying. That, of course, refers now to the rhetoric on Greenland. Third point. All of what has been said now is very bad news for Europe. The thinking of spheres of influence, the might makes right attitude, is Putinism, not the European way of doing things. And the harsh rhetoric on Greenland is frightening. Because if Trump were to make a move, especially a military move, on the independence of Greenland, of Denmark's territorial rights there, it will threaten the existence of NATO. It will be the end of NATO, as the Danish Prime Minister said. And that will have all the obvious consequences for the European security order vis-à-vis Russia, but also regarding the intra-European power competition. Now, with the situation at hand in Ukraine, things have become much more difficult to solve because of what happened in Venezuela. Over the last couple of weeks, due to the many negotiations among the Europeans with Ukraine, with the United States, and because of the many concessions that Zelensky has already made, there was a lot of movement and a lot of pressure on Putin to position himself and to finally enter negotiations. It was becoming more and more obvious that Putin is the only one who can end this war at any time, and that he is obviously not quite willing to do so just yet. With a special operation of Trump's now, it's his own kind of little military special operation in Venezuela, this pressure on Putin is easing to position himself. The United States is distracted with another area that they need to focus on, and Putin can feel, almost vindicated by this violation of international law on behalf of Trump. So what does all of that mean now for us here in Europe? And I think we should address that now in the Q&A. What does this all mean for us? I'm afraid I cannot be terribly original. I think everything that we have seen now over the weekend and everything that we can analyze now about the Venezuela case just adds up to what we've already been saying for a long time now. Europe needs to acknowledge this reality that we are in an age of great power politics, where strong actors, not just Russia and China, but increasingly the United States as well, will do what they can, and where the weak suffer what they must. We need to prevent this. As Helmut Aust rightly said, we have no alternative than to insist on international law. But we need to acknowledge that in order to enforce this, and to maintain our freedom and sovereignty and security here in Europe, we need to strengthen our own arsenal, our own power across the board, not just militarily, but also economically and politically. Again, this is not very original, but this is what we need to do now and where we need to get serious. And I think we can see first movements on that with the security guarantees for Ukraine, with a bit of a stronger statement than originally on Greenland. But I think we are not there yet. We need to do more. And as a final word on that, I think we also need to keep in mind that there is a time after Trump. It might not be a better time, thinking of a Vance administration, but there will be a time after Trump. And I would urge us to always keep in mind that there must be a possibility for a strategic reconnect between Europe and the United States. Because the United States is not just Trump, although he has a clear majority and he is the legitimate president of this country right now. But it's not just Trump. And in the long run, I think the analysis still holds that the United States and Europe would both fare better as partners and allies than on their own. That holds true for both sides. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that there is a future after Trump as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for really a tour de force of strategic security questions in the immediate future and in the long term. As you mentioned, the reconnect with the US at some point in a post-Trump world. But before we move on to those questions, perhaps let me come back to Venezuela once again, and then I want to open up for Q&A as well. Because one of the things that we read in news reports about the situation is that it wasn't isolated. There was a build-up, there was a longer US policy, and Venezuela itself also wasn't isolated. It had an Iranian drone program, apparently. Maybe the whole situation has implications for Russia and China as well. So I want to try and embed this extraction of Maduro, which of course was the big event this past weekend, in a broader set of actors that are now also affected. And some commentators have said that the US move was actually also a blow to Venezuela's allies. So I wonder, Susanne, Gratius, if you can help us situate the Venezuelan government before the US intervention a little bit more, and to derive some conclusions in terms of the international broader set of actors and allies then.
Yeah, I think what I mentioned, thank you very much, is the Monroe Doctrine refers to China and Russia. It's interesting to see that Russia has been the main external actor in the Venezuelan oil sector, which is quite in a bad shape in general. Therefore, Trump also announced investments in infrastructure, and we have to see the US military intervention in a long run and in a context of also negotiations before the military intervention, much before, many years before, between Delcy Rodriguez and US oil companies, because they are quite aware of the fact that neither Russia, nor China, nor Iran have the same level of financial and infrastructure capacity as the United States. So they try to regain the United States, to re-engage them in the oil sector. Chevron, other companies has already been present in Venezuela before that. So this is a warning or a threat to China and to Russia. which had been the main two external actors. They also tried to, or at least Russia, you find many declarations by Russian leaders on the support of Maduro. You will never find, or I haven't found anyone from the Chinese foreign ministry or any spokesperson of China in favor or of Maduro. So they are they are silent for the moment. I haven't seen any strong reaction by Russia, neither by Russia nor by China. And I mean, the main struggle in the Americas, this is before also because of the national security strategy, focuses on Latin America, because it's a kind of, we are like returning to the 19th, beginning of 20th century imperialist hemispheric policy of the United States to regain, to recover, or to re-establish U.S. dominance, which is literally in the UN, in the U.S. national security strategy, to re-establish the U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. So this might be a first step. Panama, we have seen before, was also a target. Then we have Cuba, Colombia, threats against Colombia, which is a democratic country like Mexico. It doesn't make a difference between democracies or autocracies. This is also different to, for example, George W. Bush. And I mean, the warning is mainly to China to go out of Latin America, but China is more present in Brazil. We haven't been talking about the regional actors. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, Nicaragua for sure. They strongly condemned the US military intervention in Venezuela. But other countries like Argentina, governed by Milei, Bukele in El Salvador, Daniel Noboa in Ecuador. I mean, we have all like Chile, governed from March on by the populist, the right-wing populist cast. They are they are in favor of Trump, or they are allies of Trump. So he is trying to reestablish power in the Western Hemisphere by strength, no? Make peace by strength, which is, from my point of view, impossible, no?
Thank you. I'm happy to take up questions in the audience, but since I don't see any yet, I have another one for Helmut Aust, if you don't mind, because Greenland came up a few times now, and the US administration has shown an interest in the country for a long time, and yet there's not only one way in which a US acquisition, so to speak, of Greenland could go ahead. Some have even floated the idea of the US purchasing Greenland. There are talks about perhaps a security for security package, including the Ukraine, looking to the Europeans and to Ukraine as well. So despite the fact that 85% of Greenland's inhabitants are opposed to becoming a US territory, maybe there are some ways in between becoming a fully fledged US territory. So can you walk us perhaps through the legal options that are out there for Greenland for that case?
Yes, with pleasure. I mean, this idea of a purchase or a lease has been ventilated, and also in the statements from the US administration, one can see that especially the foreign minister Maduro has tried to shift the emphasis of, or the focus of the debate a little bit in this direction, maybe to move away from the scenario of the outright use of force. And of course, first it would be preferable if there's no use of force, especially between NATO member states. But also this idea of a purchase or a lease of Greenland is something which is very difficult to square with the international legal system and its principles as it has developed in the last 80 years since the end of the Second World War. And the most important point here is the principle of self-determination. And this is where also the European heads of state and government, which have now made the statement, have emphasized that the future of Greenland must really be decided by Denmark, but even more importantly by the population of Greenland. And so what we had in the 19th century, where territorial purchases were not uncommon, and we all know the examples about Alaska and Louisiana and so on and so forth. This is something which is impossible to integrate into the international legal system. I think what one can see here, both with respect to Greenland, but also Venezuela and also other situations in which the Trump administration has been very active on the global level, is that self-determination is really a principle which is not given any respect. And we see that in the Trump 20-point plan for Gaza, for instance, which is also very much a business development plan with this idea of the creation of a special economic zone, which even found the blessing by the Security Council in Resolution 2803, which I find deeply problematic. We see that in Ukraine, where mineral resources to be exploited in this free economic zone play a role. We see that in Venezuela, and in all these situations we have a particularly disconcerting combination of foreign official policy and corporate interests which are associated with the Trump administration. And in a nutshell, Greenland has to decide at some point whether to become independent or not, but it is also clear that the Greenlanders in any case do not want to see this independence brought about by some kind of US-American takeover in whatever form it takes.
All right, let's take up some questions from the audience. I've got Markus Meckel, Hartmut Fischer, and Emil Eglitz. Perhaps we can collect some questions. If you could briefly introduce yourself and pose a question or comment, ideally directed to one of our panelists. Markus Meckel, you're first.
Good morning, Markus Meckel. I was for a long time in the German Bundestag. I appreciate very much what Patrick and Helmut said, and I agree that it was said so outspoken. And in my view, it is very important, and we have to encourage our own government to follow that way more encouragingly. But my question is related to Venezuela. I don't see and I don't understand why it is not understood that it's the time of the opposition in this country to take the ownership and really to go to the streets and to for the leading persons to take their role, because if there's a chance for democracy, it cannot done from outside. It has to be done with them and by them, and we have to support it. And I have never heard that it was said by governments, by Europeans and others, and that's why I would ask Susanne why it doesn't happen. Because all look to Trump, but he is not the decision maker. He is actor, but decision maker should be the people for themselves. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so why isn't it shouldn't it be the time for the opposition in Venezuela? Is Markus Meckel's question. Let me pick up one more by Hartmut Fischer.
Yeah, Hartmut Fischer, my name, head of Leonardo, with a think tank that's both in climate and democracy issues. And the international order as we know it, rule-based, would say is more or less dead by now, with China, Russia, and the US as members of this UN Security Council blatantly pushing imperialistic policies. Patrick Keller, you said not surprising, but very clear votum that Europe needs to get its act together to be strong enough to have its own position in this new world. And the question is, how can that be achieved? I mean, there's one probably obvious thing of how do you get faster and more majority and less unanimous decisions, so you can act on an international stage, also on the short term. But then there's the second question of, with right-wing parties / governments on the rise in Europe, there's a very fragile consensus on the whole value and what strategy do we have part, and not including Orban and maybe the Slovakian head of state. So how how can Europe be brought together to have that strength is my question.
Okay, thanks. Let me take a third question by Emil Eglit.
Thank you. My name is Emil Eglit. I'm a student of law, and I've done international law at Freie Universität with Helmut Aust. I have two small questions. The first one is directed at the entire idea of prosecuting Maduro now in the US under the Kerr-Free Speech Doctrine, as it's called, that even if the capture of the detained happened illegally, that you're still allowed to prosecute them. And I was wondering how under international law could that be justified, or is it even justifiable? And then the other question kind of circles back to what Patrick Keller has already said a little bit, and it's about how could this be a precedent for Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict to because they see Zelensky as an illegitimate president, if they could abduct him as well.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we've got 4 questions in total: Venezuelan opposition, European unanimity and capacity to act, the question of the prosecution of Maduro, and the question about precedent for Russia. Let's go in the order that we started. Susanne, Helmut, and Patrick. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the questions, especially the first one, which I would try to answer. So we have to take into account 25 years of repression in Venezuela, intimidation, harassment against the opposition. So the main opposition leaders, as I said before, live outside the country, are in exile, like Juan Guaidó, like many others, some of them in Spain, others in the United States. 8 million people left the country, between 7 and 8 million over the years. So there's a large exodus, mainly towards the United States, which is also an argument to maybe have a regime change or have a transition, preferably peaceful transition in Venezuela, which has always been the argument of the European Union. Again, in the last declaration of the European Union, they also mentioned Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo González Urrutia, the two opposition candidates which won the elections, because they published the electoral documents and the Maduro government did not publish any results officially, so they lost the elections. We could see that also by the reaction in Venezuela, that nearly very few people supported the government. Most people stayed at home, being afraid of what will happen next. It was a military attack, so at least 80 people died. Maybe not on the US side, but Venezuelans and Cubans, which has been also a country very much present under the Maduro and before the Chavez regime in the country. They have key positions, the personal security of Maduro, for example. So they failed in the sense Maduro was betrayed by somebody. And I think the logical thing would have been that the opposition will take power. But how is that possible? How can they do that? They live outside the country. The armed forces are staying behind the regime because they are like benefiting from the drugs, arms, and whatever, all kind of businesses. So which is the incentive for the armed forces to leave power? This is a key question which has not been answered. So I think the Trump didn't help. No, it was like many people were very happy here in Madrid that now the Maduro is not anymore in power. But the logical reaction would have been that now Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo González Urrutia will run the country, but it hasn't happened, and they have not the capacity to take power. How can they do that? With the US avoiding, it's like they are the main obstacle to a democratic transition, maybe.
Got it. Helmut Aust.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the question to Emil Iglit. Hello. On the question of the prosecution, I think there are various layers here, and of course, it is clear that irrespective of the status as president or not, an abduction by force by a state is also a violation of international human rights law, as it is also established in customary international law. But of course, for Maduro, the key question here is, first of all, what is the relevance of his immunity that he enjoys in a personal capacity as head of state. Now, the United States, of course, argues the government that they have never recognized Maduro, especially not since the 2024 presidential elections. But in the view of most authorities in international law, this would not be a convincing argument, as this would then lead to the situation where states can individually decide whom they respect as a head of state, and this would really put the X at the established categories of personal immunities. Now, it is conceivable that a new government in Venezuela could waive the immunity of President Maduro. So this could be one factor for the assessment of the legality of the trial, and this could also bring us to the situation where we would discuss this old maxim of male captus bene detentus. So even if you have been abducted unlawfully, you can still be tried in a lawful way for crimes you may have committed. But it's very hard to predict how these, or maybe it's not so hard to predict. So it's rather likely that the international law issues will not be very determinative before the US courts, because US courts have a strong tradition of deference to the executive, of a political questions doctrine. And so if the US government will certify that the apprehension of Maduro was lawful, most US courts would probably be inclined to take that as face value and not question the decision of the executive, which is a structural difference to how courts in Europe would go about in this regard.
Thanks. Over to you, Patrick.
Yes, thank you. I will answer the two questions that were directed at me. The first one by Helmut Fischer on how Europe can get its act together, especially given the many problems that we have here in our own countries and in the political landscape. This is, of course, the $1 million question, and it's been asked forever, and now it's getting more urgent than ever. I accept all the difficulties that you present. So I think what we need to do is we need to break it down into more practical things that can be done. And I would just offer three things that Europe could do and that the European nations could do right now. First is increase our competitiveness. Think of the Draghi report, which is over a year old by now, and where I think it's one of the most shameful failures of the last months that so little has been done with it on the European level and in the European nations to increase our economic competitiveness, because that's the basis of the power play that we are entering. I think we need to do a lot there. The second thing is, of course, the military buildup. There, a lot has been done, at least in terms of freeing money and of a change in mindset. But still, I would argue, and we could go into details here, that the ramp up is not happening at the speed and the intensity and the scale that is required. And I think we're still in the baby steps mode, despite all the changes that have been made. And I think this needs to change. And the third idea, I think what Europe can do to get its act together is to be very creative within the frameworks that we have right now. As an example, when we talk about Greenland now, I would hope, and I'm sure it's happening behind the scenes already, but I would hope for a European initiative within NATO to address the security concerns of the United States regarding Greenland and the access to the Atlantic that Russian and other troops might have across the GeoGAP. What can be done about Greenland? Can we station more troops there? Can we have more NATO exercises? Be creative, find new ways of addressing this. Not because I think that Trump will change his mind and finally think, no, I don't need to own this piece of land, he will continue to have this reflex. But we need to be creative in order to kick the can down the road and sit this thing out, to just, postpone the day when Trump will make a fateful decision, or hope that that time will play in our hands. So I think this kind of creativity and leadership is necessary and very possible too, on the part of the Europeans. On the question by Emil Eglet on whether Russia might see the capture of Maduro as a precedent for what they could do with Zelensky. I think Putin's Russia doesn't need encouragement there. I'm very certain that Russia would love to capture and or assassinate Volodymyr Zelensky. And they have tried. Think about the beginning of the war when they were actually planning to take Kiev by storm. And I'm sure many things are happening that we don't even know about. To me, this just adds up to the heroism of Zelensky and the Ukrainian defensive effort, that this man is so well protected and so present despite the threat that he is living under. Remember the sentence, this famous quote in the beginning of the war when the United States offered to exile to Zelensky, and he said, "I need ammunition, not a ride." I think that's the attitude of Zelensky under this threat. But I think it also tells a story about our sometimes exaggerated fear of Russia. Not because we misunderstand the bad intentions of Russia, but I think we exaggerate and overestimate the actual capability of Russia. The fact that Zelensky is still alive and active the way he is shows that Russia is not able to capture him. It is, well, from a military point of view, one could actually, admire what the United States did in Venezuela. I mean, this was a military operation that was very well integrated, from drones to intelligence to fighter jets to operation on the ground. This was really well done, and the Russian air defenses did not look very good there in Caracas. But this is a side point. I think Russia just cannot, operate on the level that the United States can, and this is also a lesson to be learned.
Thanks so much, Patrick. I can see questions being forwarded by our events team to me in the chat, but I will prioritize those that have raised their hands for a while now. So I will take up at least 2 more questions from Elisabeth Hofberger and Klaus Wittmann in that order.
Yes, thank you very much, and apologies that I can't turn off on my video, but I'm having people here working in my apartment, so I hope it doesn't make too much noise. I would have a very brief question to Helmut Aust regarding Greenland once again, and what the European Union could actually do. I mean, Greenland, of course, is not a sovereign state, but would there be any possibility that, for example, Greenland could rejoin, not as an official member, but as being part of Danish territory, rejoin the European Union? And the second question is, obviously, Article 42, paragraph 7 of the EU Treaty is not applicable to Greenland, but would there be the possibility to extend to a certain degree Article 42 to Greenland in case all EU members agreed? I mean, the probability is quite low, I guess, but just from a legal perspective, I would be interested what could be done to enhance the security of Greenland and therefore European security in general. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Klaus Wittmann.
Good morning. Yes, to Patrick Keller, whose analysis and bleak outlook also on Ukraine I share, and I would like to pursue this for a moment. Yes, the pressure on Russia is easing, even if Trump ever realized that he is being manipulated by Putin. His interest in Ukraine's fate will even be more reduced. So we Europeans must heighten the pressure on Trump, and all the issues are back. The frozen assets, the shadow fleet, deep strike weapons such as Taurus, etc., and much stronger and continuous naming and shaming of the criminal character of this war. And before we develop the details of so-called security guarantees, we must draw conclusions from the insight that Putin will only make concessions if the failure of his war is in sight. And for years, I have been fighting this nimbus of Russian invincibility to which Patrick also referred. And my question is just, what do you think about this?
Thanks, Patrick. You will have to answer with words, and you can't just clap in response to the question by Klaus Wittmann in a moment.
I thought I'd just save us some time. I fully agree with Klaus. That's what I think about it.
And allow me to throw in perhaps a third question that I saw in the chat, which is on the recent seizure of Shadow Fleet ships by the US. The question is, do we expect Russian retaliation against US assets directly or through proxies? So what's to be expected in the next steps that we see in this broader conflict? But first, Helmut Aust on the legal questions on Greenland.
Yes, thank you to Elisabeth Hofberger for these questions. Very, very pertinent ones. I would say that it would be conceivable to bring Greenland again into a closer relationship with the EU, but given that we see that the situation is evolving very dynamically, maybe this would simply take too much time, and I think a swift political response is needed, and with that we cannot wait to go through long processes of integrating Greenland into the European Union. On the Article 42, paragraph 7 question, this is maybe for the non-lawyers in the audience, the kind of Article 5 provision that the European Union has. It has many similarities to Article 5 of the NATO treaty, also some differences. I would say that in essence, both Article 5 and Article 42.7 both rely on credibility and trust. Both provisions eventually say that you will come to the rescue of an attacked state with the means you deem appropriate, and so states have a lot of leeway anyway with respect to how they practically implement commitments both under Article 5 of the NATO Treaty and Article 47 of the Treaty on the European Union. Legally speaking, in the case of use of force and armed attack by the United States against Greenland, of course, Denmark would have the right to self-defense, and this could also be exercised together with other states. We have a collective right of self-defense, but this is probably a very hypothetical situation. No one of us wants to talk about that and think about that, and it's also probably not very realistic to assume that there will be an armed conflict between the United States and EU member states about Greenland for various reasons, which I think we can all imagine. But anything should be done to prevent that, and credible security guarantees in political ways can be tried to be implemented, but the credibility that this is actually meaningful is probably what is key here.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, over to you.
On the Shadow Fleet and possible retaliation by Russia to the seizing of its vessels. In politics, as in life, it is always good to consider the consequences of your actions before you act. And I think it is very smart to think about how Putin will react to certain steps that we undertake in Ukraine and against his empire. But I think we should not be afraid that whatever we do will lead to escalation or worse outcomes for us. If we look at what is happening in Ukraine and in Europe as a whole, thinking of the hybrid attacks, not to mention what's happening in Russia itself, all of that happens without any provocation or action on part of the Ukrainians or the West. I think we got the logic turned on its head by thinking that whatever we do to protect ourselves or to set boundaries to Putin's aggression, we further this aggression. I think it is the other way around. By not presenting a clear stop sign, by not enforcing the decisions that we have made, also the legal decisions that we have made about sanctions, for instance, by not enforcing that, we show weakness and give encouragement to the aggressor. I think, and in this they are similar, Trump and Putin. Putin respects and understands strength. And this is the nature of great power politics. You need to set a clear boundary and you need to send messages. And I think with the current, what happened last night, with the current seizing of the Russian oil tanker, you have a fine example of that. There was a long chase of this vessel. The Russian vessel was shadowed by a Russian submarine. And still, the United States took the risk of seizing that vessel. And the reaction from Russia, the official statements from, I think it was the Minister of Transportation, the official reaction was, to my mind, rather timid, saying this is unacceptable, but that was about it. And it was a message from a, let's say, minor actor in Russia. Of course, there might be reactions to it. There might be, you know, some kind of hybrid attack or physical attack on American assets someplace. But I think the Russians will consider very much how that will again then react and provoke the Trump administration. So I think this is the general idea. We have, of course, to be measured in our responses. We always need to make clear that we have no designs on Russia. We do not want to seize Russian territory. We do not want to attack Russia as such. But at the same time, we need to be very clear that we are willing to use all measures at our disposal to defend against Russian aggression. And that includes military action, that includes the seizing of assets in a defensive manner. And I would encourage us to be more forthcoming about this.
Thanks so much, Patrick. I'm afraid we're running out of time, and although I can see many more questions in the chat, we have to wrap up very, very soon. So I just want to give all of our panelists a chance in about 30 seconds each to think about how this year 2026 has started in terms of the geopolitical shifts. And if you had to make any sort of prediction over the next 12 months, where will it end? Both with regard to the situation in Venezuela and the US itself, but also the one in the broader international security field. And I'd like to do this in the order that we started, Susanne, Helmut, and then Patrick, and then I'm afraid we have to close.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's very difficult to predict. We are living in very uncertain times, so we don't know what will be next in the US. The important thing will be midterm elections in the United States. Trump is losing popular support, so we might expect that the checks and balances, maybe they will be there again, because there are no for the moment, no? In Venezuela, it's very difficult to predict. Maybe we'll see a type of transition, but I think this is a secondary question for Trump. He's not promoting democracy. He's not a liberal at all. He's an illiberal president. So this is also important to say when we compare him, for example, by George W. Bush, which has been a Republican, but a very different philosophy behind. And then I would like to point out the irrelevance of the international organizations. We had a UN security meeting. Nothing came out of that, neither in Gaza, nor in Ukraine, nor now in Venezuela. So this is like a license for having those military attacks in the future. This gives a license to the US, to Russia, to whoever, whichever state would like to intervene. So this is very dangerous. And also in Latin America, the polarization between right-wing and more left presidents, and the impossibility to make a collective statement against what we can see like a re-establishment of US imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. It's very sad.
Yeah, and that's more than enough. Helmut Aust.
Yes, that's a tough one. 30 seconds. How did the year start? How will it evolve? I think we had 2 good days at the beginning of the year, and then the hope that the year would be better disappeared. If I try to be optimistic, I would envision a situation which will not mean that we will get rid of all of our problems, but where states like member states of the European Union have realized that if they build coalitions also with other states across the globe who are not convinced of this neo-imperial world, that US, Russia, and China can just divide the spoils. If this can be realized that we need to be more creative and forthcoming in coalition building, then I think the international order has also a chance for survival. It's not the case that states are in the minority who insist that international law must be upheld. They are divided by the fear against the bullies which are acting, and if all the states which find themselves alienated by these practices of these three imperial powers try to work together, then it will at least be more difficult for these neo-imperial tendencies to prevail.
Thanks, Patrick.
Yes, just to build on that, I think building alliances also includes building alliances with those in the United States of America who still believe in liberal democracy and the liberal international order. Don't give up on those people too quickly. I don't think that we will have a return to the good old times, whatever they were. Even after Trump, we will not have a transatlantic relationship that is mainly a friendship or whatever. I think it never was, but it will not return to this kind of fantasy. But at the same time, remember that Trump will not last forever. And if you look at what is happening currently in his MAGA movement, you can see the fault lines happening. You can see it around the Epstein files. You can see it around the issue of Israel and anti-Semitism. You can see it around the Nick Fuentes controversy in the blogosphere. You see it with Marjorie Traitor Greene in Congress. And you see it with the current debates about interventionism, US interventionism, and whether that should happen or not under a MAGA presidency. I think it is very curious how little we hear from J.D. Vance on the whole Venezuela thing. So this is just to say what we have experiencing as a movement and as a political movement in the United States, created and led by Trump, is of course effective, and we need to react to that, and we need to build up European strength and capacity either way. But we will have also an opportunity to address a different America sometime down the road, and we need to be prepared for that as well from a position of strength.
Well, that's a mildly happy note to end this briefing on. Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to you in the audience for engaging this morning. We'll be back with more morning briefings on subsequent Thursdays, but for now, thanks everyone and have a nice day.